The radio crackled softly in the darkness, and that's when Carlos knew they were all dead. Their guide, the man they paid $15,000 to lead them through secret tunnels under the border wall, was speaking in coded phrases to someone on the other end. Not the nervous chatter of a smuggler coordinating with partners, but the calm, professional communication of law enforcement. Carlos pressed himself deeper into the shadows of the tunnel, watching as Agent Rodriguez, because that's who their coyote really was, confirmed the position of 12 desperate Nicaraguans who thought they were crawling toward freedom but were actually crawling into a trap. It had started 3 weeks earlier in a safe house in Tijuana. The group had been assembled carefully. Families with children, young men seeking work, a grandmother who just wanted to see her son in Los Angeles one more time before she died. They'd all heard about El Lobo, the wolf, the guide who had a perfect record. No one he guided had ever been caught. His tunnels were unknown to Border Patrol. His methods were foolproof. The man who appeared at the safe house looked the part perfectly. Weather-beaten face, calloused hands, the wary eyes of someone who lived outside the law. He spoke with the accent of northern Mexico, used the slang of the borderlands, carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey hundreds of times. He even showed them videos on his phone, happy migrants emerging from tunnels into American soil, testimonials from successful crossings. Carlos had been suspicious in the beginning, though he couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was how El Lobo's clothes were too clean for someone who supposedly spent nights crawling through tunnels. Maybe it was how his hands, though calloused, had the specific calluses of someone who spent time at a shooting range, not digging. Or maybe it was just Carlos's natural paranoia, sharpened by 2 failed crossing attempts that had left him poorer and more desperate. The group had pooled their money, some selling everything they owned, others borrowing from relatives who'd made it to America years before. $15,000 a group, El Lobo had said, which was reasonable for his success rate. He'd spent days with them, learning their names, their stories, why they needed to cross. He seemed genuinely interested in their lives, remembering details about their children, their hopes for work in America. It felt personal, like he cared. The night of the crossing, El Lobo had led them to an industrial area near the border. The entrance of the tunnel was hidden inside a warehouse that smelled of motor oil and rust. He'd given them each a small flashlight, bottles of water, and most importantly, hope. The tunnel was narrow but well constructed, with wooden supports and even electrical lighting in some sections. Professional work, El Lobo had assured them, built by the cartel's best engineers. As they crawled through the darkness, El Lobo had kept up a steady patter of encouragement. Just a little further, he'd say, America was right above them. Their new lives were minutes away. The grandmother struggled with confined space, and El Lobo had helped her personally, showing a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. The children whimpered occasionally, and he'd produce candy from his pockets, keeping their spirits up. It was Carlos's job in the group to watch their backs, make sure no one was following. That's why he'd noticed when El Lobo had dropped back, claiming he needed to check something. Carlos had followed at a distance, his suspicions finally given purpose. In a wider section of the tunnel, he'd watched El Lobo pull out not a cell phone but a radio, the kind law enforcement used, with encryption and official frequencies. The conversation Carlos overheard was devastating in its implications. El Lobo was reporting their exact position, the number in the group, even specific details about who was carrying what. He mentioned something about Operation Tunnel Rat and confirmed that surveillance teams were in position at the exit. The entire crossing was a setup, and they were the bait to justify budgets and prove the effectiveness of new border security initiatives. Carlos's mind raced. He could warn the others, but that would only cause panic in a confined space. They couldn't go back. The entrance was certainly being watched now. They couldn't go forward. Agents were waiting. They were trapped in a tunnel that had become a cage, led there by a man whose betrayal was so complete it took his breath away. He made a decision that would haunt him forever. Carlos quietly moved to the front of the group, where his brother Diego was helping carry the grandmother. He whispered urgently in Diego's ear, telling him what he'd seen, what he'd heard. Diego's face went pale in the flashlight beam, but he understood immediately. They had to create a distraction, give some of the group a chance to scatter. The plan they improvised was desperate and unlikely, but it was all they had. When they reached the section where the tunnel branched, one path leading to main exit, another to what El Lobo had dismissed as a dead end, they would cause a commotion. Some would continue with El Lobo to the trap, buying time for others to explore the supposed dead end, hoping it led somewhere, anywhere but into custody. As they approached the branch, Carlos's heart hammered so hard he was sure El Lobo would hear it. The agent was back in his role now, encouraging and guiding, completely unaware that his cover was blown. When they reached the split, Diego suddenly cried out, claiming the grandmother had collapsed. In the confusion that followed, with El Lobo rushing to help, Carlos and 3 others slipped down the alternate tunnel. Behind them, they could hear El Lobo calling out, his voice shifting from concerned guide to authoritative agent as he realized what happened. The sound of radio chatter echoed through the tunnels as he called in the split, requesting backup to cover multiple exits. But Carlos's group was already moving, following the narrow passage that seemed to go on forever. The alternate tunnel was older, partially collapsed in places. They had to dig through loose earth with their hands, squeeze through gaps that barely accommodated their bodies. Behind them, they could hear pursuit, not the chaotic scramble of criminals, but the organized advance of trained agents who knew these tunnels better than any smuggler ever could, because they had built them. This entire network was a honey trap, constructed by Border Patrol to lure and capture desperate migrants. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, they emerged not into America, but into a drainage pipe that led back to the Mexican side. They'd traveled in a circle, the tunnel designed to confuse and exhaust. But at least they were free, for now. Carlos could see the lights of Tijuana in the distance, could taste the bitter irony of their escape, leading them back to where they'd started. Over the next days, through migrant networks and whispered conversations, Carlos learned the full scope of the operation. Agent Rodriguez had been operating as El Lobo for 2 years, building a reputation as a reliable guide while actually feeding groups into custody. The tunnel system was real but compromised from the beginning, built with Homeland Security funds as part of a larger sting operation. The sophistication of it was breathtaking. They created an entire mythology around El Lobo, seeding stories of successful crossings, even staging fake testimonial videos. The safe houses were monitored. The other migrants who vouched for him were either agents or previous victims forced to cooperate. Every aspect of the smuggling operation was actually a government operation designed to gather intelligence and make high-profile arrests. Carlos learned that his group had been specifically targeted because they included several people the government wanted to make examples of: the grandmother whose son was a vocal immigration activist, a young man whose cousin had been deported multiple times, families that represented sympathetic cases that could be used to show the government was protecting migrants from dangerous smugglers. The cruelest part was that Agent Rodriguez would face no consequences. He'd been doing his job, enforcing immigration law through deception. The migrants had no legal recourse. They'd been engaged in illegal activity, had no standing complaint about being tricked. Rodriguez would probably receive a commendation for his innovative enforcement techniques, while the people he betrayed faced deportation and debt. Diego hadn't made it out. Carlos learned later that his brother had been arrested at the main exit, had sacrificed himself to maintain the distraction that allowed Carlos to escape. He was processed, detained, and deported within weeks. The grandmother had been released due to her age and health, but was now banned from ever entering the United States legally. The families were scattered, some deported, some still in detention, all betrayed by the man they trusted with their lives. The tunnel system continued to operate. New groups were led by new versions of El Lobo, agents playing smugglers, building trust only to destroy at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Carlos tried to warn others, but who would believe such an elaborate deception? It sounded like paranoid fantasy, the desperate excuse of a failed crossing. The operation's success depended on its unbelievability. Carlos found himself stuck in Tijuana, unable to try again, unable to go home. The money was gone, paid to a government agent for the privilege of being arrested. His brother was back in Nicaragua, bearing the stigma of deportation. The network of family and friends who contributed to their crossing fund felt betrayed twice. Once by the failure, again by the revelation that their money had gone to the very government they were trying to evade. He took work in Maquiladora, the factories that lined the border, making products for American consumers he'd never join. Every shift, he could see the wall that El Lobo had promised to guide them under. Sometimes he'd see groups gathering in the shadows, whispering about guides who knew secret routes. He wanted to warn them, but knew they wouldn't listen. Desperation made people believe in miracles, even when those miracles came with badges hidden under rough clothes. The psychological damage was worse than the financial loss. Carlos found himself unable to trust anyone, seeing potential agents in every friendly face. When legitimate smugglers approached him with new opportunities, he couldn't distinguish between real criminals and government employees playing criminals. The border had become a theater where every actor might be performing for an audience of enforcement agencies. Months later, Carlos encountered another survivor from their group, a young father who'd been in the main tunnel when the arrests happened. He described a moment when El Lobo had transformed from guy to agent, how his entire demeanor had changed as backup arrived. The gentle man who'd helped the grandmother had efficiently zip-tied wrists and read Miranda rights in perfect English. The transformation was so complete that some migrants initially thought it was a robbery, unable to comprehend that their savior was their captor. The operation, the father had learned during processing, was part of a larger initiative to infiltrate and destroy smuggling networks. By becoming the most successful smuggler, Agent Rodriguez had drawn in not just migrants, but actual criminals who wanted to partner with him. The migrants were collateral damage, necessary losses in a larger war on trafficking. Their dreams and desperation were just data points in government reports showing the operation's success. Carlos thought often about that moment in the tunnel, when he'd heard the radio crackle, when the truth had revealed itself in coded phrases and professional calm. How many before him had made that same journey, followed that same voice into custody? How many after him would trust the weathered face and callous hands that belonged to a man who went home each night to a government salary and a clear conscience? The border had always been cruel, but this was cruelty refined into science. It wasn't enough to catch people crossing. Now they orchestrated the crossings themselves. They created the hope they would destroy, built the tunnels they would raid, became the criminals they claimed to fight. Agent Rodriguez probably had a file full of commendations for his innovative enforcement, while the people he betrayed had files full of deportation orders. Sometimes Carlos would see news reports about successful tunnel raids, large groups arrested in sophisticated underground passages. He wondered how many were genuine smuggling operations and how many were government theater, agents playing coyotes leading the desperate into custody. The reports never mentioned that distinction. Success was measured in arrests, not in the ethics of how those arrests were achieved. He wrote to Diego sometimes, letters full of careful phrases that avoided the full truth. How could he explain that the man who'd helped their grandmother to the tunnel was collecting a government paycheck for her arrest? That the testimonials they'd watched were probably staged by the Department of Homeland Security? That their perfect guide for perfection should have been the warning sign? The truth was too bitter for letters that crossed borders more successfully than people. Years passed, but Carlos remained in Tijuana, caught between the country he'd left and the country that had rejected him through deception. He aged into someone who could spot the signs. Guides who were too professional, tunnels that were too well built, operations that ran too smoothly. He became a cautionary voice in migrant communities, the paranoid man warning about government coyotes, mostly dismissed as traumatized by failure. But occasionally someone would listen, would recognize something in his story that matched their own suspicions. They compared notes about guides who asked too many questions, who seemed too interested in personal details, who had equipment too good for criminals. Small networks of knowledge formed, trying to distinguish between real smugglers, dangerous but honest about their criminality, and government agents playing smugglers, safe until the moment of betrayal. The wall stood as it always had, a physical barrier that spawned increasingly creative attempts to breach it. But now Carlos knew the greater barrier was psychological. The knowledge that the person offering to help you cross might be the person ensuring you never would. Trust itself had been weaponized, turned into a tool of enforcement more effective than any physical obstacle. Agent Rodriguez probably still operated somewhere, under a new name, building a new reputation, leading new groups into new traps. The tunnel Carlos had crawled through might have been sealed or might still be in use, guiding the hopeful into handcuffs. The innovation of turning enforcement into entrapment had proven too successful to abandon. Carlos's story ended not with resolution, but with resignation. He'd survived by recognizing deception, escaped by accepting defeat. Others in his group had reached America, in detention centers and deportation flights, but technically across the border. El Lobo had kept his promise in the cruelest way possible, guiding them to American soil just long enough to be arrested on it. The radio crackle in the darkness had saved Carlos by destroying his hope. He'd learned that the border wasn't just a place but a performance, where agents played criminals and migrants played unwitting extras in their own capture. Somewhere tonight, another group was following another guide through another tunnel, believing in another set of lies that would deliver them exactly where the government wanted them. Into custody, into statistics, into proof that the system worked by becoming the system it claimed to fight.